Welcome back, guys. All right, we have a fairly long letter today. We are actually on volume 2 of Moral Letters to Lucilius, and this is letter 66 on the various aspects of virtue. So let's just jump right into this here. He says here, I have just seen my former schoolmate, Clanaris, for the first time in many years. You need not wait for me to add that he is an old man, but I assure you that I found him hale in spirit and study, although he is wrestling with a frail and feeble body. For nature acted unfairly when she gave him a poor domicile for so rare a soul. Or perhaps it was because she wished to prove to us that an absolutely strong and happy mind can lie hidden under any exterior. Be that as it may, Clanaris overcomes all these hindrances and by despising his own body has arrived at a stage where he can despise other things too. Okay, so he's talking about his friend, obviously a frail person, but with a strong mind, and he's asking the question whether or not that nature had given him this just to prove what can lie under this frail exterior. Okay, so let's move on here. All right, he says in verse 2, the poet who sang, "Worth shows more pleasing in a form that's fair," it is, in my opinion, mistaken. For virtue needs nothing to set it off. It is its own great glory, and it hallows the body in which it dwells. At any rate, I have begun to regard Clanaris in a different light. He seems to be handsome, and as well set up in body as in mind. All right, so here he's talking about a quote from one of the poets who said, "Worth shows more pleasing in a form that's fair." So he disagrees with this because this statement is saying that when someone looks good, then they are good, right? That's that halo effect, if you've heard about that in psychology. But he's saying no, that's not the case here. But he's saying I kind of see him as handsome, all right, because of what exists underneath this exterior. Verse 3, a great man can spring from a hovel, and so can a beautiful and great soul from an ugly and insignificant body. For this reason, nature seems to me to breed certain men of the stamp with the idea of proving that virtue springs into birth in any place whatever. Had it been possible for her to produce souls by themselves and naked, she would have done so. As it is, nature does still a greater thing, for she produces certain men who, though hampered through their bodies, nonetheless break through the obstruction. So he's saying here that there are certain men that that show how a great soul can exist in an ugly or insignificant body, right? I was thinking, if nature could just produce a soul by itself without a body, then that would be great. But however, what happens is actually better than that. Instead, she produces certain men, although hampered their bodies, break through, right? How do they break through? They break through with their mind, with their personality, who they are. I think Clanaris has been produced as a pattern that we might be enabled to understand that the soul is not disfigured by the ugliness of the body, but rather the opposite, that the body is beautified by the comeliness of the soul. Now, though Clanaris and I have spent very few days together, we have nevertheless had many conversations, which I will at once pour forth and pass on to you. So again, he's saying here that it's a pattern that Clanaris is produced by. To understand this, that the soul is not disfigured by the ugliness of the body, but rather it's the opposite. The body is beautified by the beauty of the soul. Okay, and now he's going to talk about the conversation that he's had with Clemaris. All right. So he says, the first days we investigated this problem. How can goods be equal if they are of three kinds? For certain of them, according to our philosophical tenets, are primary, such as joy, peace, and the welfare of one's country. Others are of the second order, molded in an unhappy material, such as the enduring of suffering and the self-control during severe illness. We shall pray outright for the goods of the first class. For the second class, we shall pray only if the need shall arise. There is still a third variety, as, for example, a modest gait, a calm and honest countenance, and the bearing that suits the man of wisdom. Okay, so breaking this down, what is he saying here? All right, so they're having this conversation. This is the discussion. How can these goods be equal if they're three different kinds? So if he's talking about virtue, if he's talking about the goods, right, there's three different kinds of goods, right? And there's this primary, right, which is the joy, peace, welfare of the country. There's a second order, right, which is enduring suffering, self-control, right? And we pray for the goods of the first class. We want the first one. The second one, we only say, God, give me patience when we need it, right? The third one is just these qualities that you have: a modest gait, calm and honest countenance, right? So in verse 6, he says, how can these things be equal when we compare them? If you grant that we ought to pray for the one and avoid the other, if we would make distinctions among them, we had better return to the first good and consider what its nature is. The soul that gazes upon truth, that is skilled in what should be sought and what should be avoided, establishing standards of value, not according to opinion, but according to nature. The soul that penetrates the whole world and directs its contemplating gaze upon all the phenomena, paying strict attention to thoughts and actions, equally great and forceful, superior alike to hardships and blandishments, yielding itself to neither extreme of fortune, rising above all blessings and tribulations, absolutely beautiful, perfectly equipped with grace as well as strength, healthy and sinewy, unruffled, undismayed, one which no violence can shatter, one which acts of chance can neither exalt nor depress. A soul like this is virtue itself. All right. He's given a great depiction of the Stoic view of what is virtue, or what is a virtuous soul. Okay. So he's saying here, if we say that some of these things we want and other things we don't want, then how can they be equal? Well, we got to look back at the first good. When he's saying the first good here, he's saying the soul itself, like the great soul. Okay, and so what are the characteristics of the soul? Okay, it gazes upon the truth. It's skilled in what should be sought and what should be avoided. Right? He goes on to list all these things, but what it comes down to is discernment. A soul that contemplates the correct things, that has learned how to yield when it needs to yield, right? One that's invincible, right? That fortune can't increase or diminish, right? So these are a lot of the tenets of Stoicism that we've talked about many times. In verse 7, he says, there you have its outward appearance. It should ever come under a single view and show itself once in all its completeness. But there are many aspects of it. They unfold themselves according as life varies and as actions differ, but virtue itself does not become less or greater. For the supreme good cannot diminish, nor may virtue retrograde. Rather, it is transformed now into one quality and now into another, shaping itself according to the part which it is to play. So his answer here, if you didn't catch this, is he's saying, look, here's the thing. You've got these different aspects of what is good and virtue. But he's saying that you can bring it under one single view. All right? And here's how you see it. There's different aspects of it. Okay? And in the different situations in life, you see these different ones. That's why he says the supreme good cannot diminish, nor may virtue retrograde, rather is transformed. One quality, another quality. So all these things that we talked about of virtue, of the good, they're actually aspects of the same thing, right? When you think about this, if you are a person with discernment who understands, who has done the work and become a wise man, as the Stoics would say, then you're going to see, you're going to adapt to what this, you're going to be the things, the goods, the virtues in the various circumstances, because it is all part of the same thing. You don't have to learn each one of them. They're all part of the same thing. It's that development of character. In verse 8, he says, whatever it has touched, it brings into likeness with itself and dyes with its own color. It adorns our actions, our friendships, and sometimes entire households, which has entered and set in order. Whatever it has handled, it forthwith makes lovable, notable, admirable. Therefore, the power and the greatness of virtue cannot rise to greater heights, because increase is denied to that which is superlatively great. You'll find nothing straighter than the straight, nothing truer than the truth, and nothing more temperate than that which is temperate. So he's saying here that you can't increase this virtue, right? It is the greatest. We're talking about the greatest good, the greatest virtue. It has no where to go from there, because it is at the top. Every virtue is limitless, for limits depend upon definite measurements. Constancy cannot advance further any more than fidelity or truthfulness or loyalty. What can be added to that which is perfect? Nothing, otherwise that was not perfect to which something has been added. Nor can anything be added to virtue either, for if anything can be added thereto, it must have contained a defect. Honor also permits of no addition, for it is honorable because of the very qualities which I have mentioned. What then? Do you think that propriety, justice, lawfulness do not also belong to the same type, and that they are kept within fixed limits? The ability to increase is proof that the thing is still imperfect. So this is a good way to think about things. If something can be increased, it is imperfect. What he's saying, he's not saying the degree to which you exhibit honor, let's say, or loyalty or truthfulness. What he's saying is that these things themselves are perfect in themselves and virtuous, and that there is no increase of it. These concepts, right? And that's the thing to understand here. In verse 10, he says, the good, in every instance, is subject to these same laws. The advantage of the state and that of the individual are yoked together. Indeed, it is as impossible to separate them as to separate the commendable from the desirable. The commendable from the desirable. Therefore, virtues are mutually equal, and so are the works of virtue. And all men who are so fortunate as to possess these virtues. So here again, he's just making this comparison, and he's saying that you can't take these things apart. All right? Virtues are mutually equal, and so are the works of virtue, and the men who possess them. These are things that are bound together. So you can talk about virtue, but the works of the virtue are the same thing as the men who produce them. These are all belong to the same. But since the virtues of plants and of animals are perishable, they are also frail and fleeting and uncertain. They spring up and they sink down again, and for this reason, they are not rated at the same value. But to human virtues, only one rule applies. For right reason is single and of but one kind. Nothing is more divine than the divine, or more heavenly than the heavenly. So he's saying here that the virtues of plants and animals, they're perishable. They disappear. Like a plant should do what it does, an animal should do what it does, right? they're variable. It depends on the plant. It depends on the animal. Okay, they spring up, they sink down again. They're not at the same value. But human virtues, there's just one rule that applies. Right reason is single and of but one kind. So he's saying that the right reasoning, there's no variability in this. Wisdom is wisdom. There's not flavors of it, right? He's saying that there is an answer to the question. There is a right way to be. There is a right way to act. There is a virtuous way. There is a way to handle a situation, right? There's one that is better than others. That's what he's saying in this case. And it's understanding that. Moral things decay, fall, are worn out, grow up, are exhausted and replenished. Hence, in their case, in the view of uncertainty of their lot, there is inequality. But of things divine, the nature is one. Reason, however, is nothing else than a portion of the divine spirit set in a human body. If reason is divine, and the good in no case lacks reason, then the good in every case is divine. And furthermore, there is no distinction between things divine. Hence, there is none between goods either. Therefore, it follows that joy and a brave, unyielding endurance of torture are equal goods. For in both there is the same greatness of soul, relaxed and cheerful in one case, and in the other, combative and braced for action. So the point that he's getting at here is that he starts off by saying moral things decay, right? Which we know. But things of divine nature, they're one. All right. Now, reason, he's saying, is basically divine nature set into the human body. So he's holding that up as the highest truth, as the divine. All right. And he's saying if reason's divine and good in no case lacks reason, then good in every case is divine. Right. Okay. So the good is divine. And so there's no distinction between things divine. And if there's no distinction between things divine, then neither between good. So then he's saying, look, okay, when we first asked this question of which virtues or which things were better, or how can they be the same? He's saying they are the same because they're all divine. So there's no distinction. It's just as good. It's just as divine. It's just as virtuous to be a person who has the endurance of torture as it is for a person that follows a joy and brave and that has a brave and unyielding spirit, right? That like he's saying that. I'm trying to pick out his two examples here. He says here, therefore it follows that a joy and brave unyielding endurance of torture are equal goods, for in both there is the same greatness of soul, right? Relaxed and cheerful in one case, in the other combative and brace for action. So the point here really, in that we can get from this, is that they all lead to the same source. And I think the way that I find this useful in my life is to realize that if you're lacking in one area, you're lacking in other areas. That reason, rationale, good sense, we could say wisdom in this case, it's all the same thing. And so if you think that you're wise, but you're stumbling somewhere, you probably still lack that wisdom because it is all part of the same. In verse 13, he says, "What? Do you think that the virtue of him who bravely storms the enemy's stronghold is equal to that of him who endures a siege with the utmost patience? Great is Scipio when he invests in Numantia and constrains and compels the hands of an enemy whom he could not conquer to resort to their own destruction. Great also are the souls of the defenders, men who knew that as long as the path to death lies open, the blockade is not complete. Men who breathe their last in the arms of liberty. In like manner, the other virtues are also equal as compared with one another: tranquility, simplicity, generosity, constancy, equanimity, endurance. For underlying them all is a single virtue, that which renders the soul straight and unswerving. Again, he's making that emphasis that it is all one. They all have the same value. Don't try to judge virtue because you can't say this act is more virtuous than another one because they all come from the same exact source. What then, you say, is there no difference between joy and unyielding endurance of pain? None at all, as regards to virtues themselves. Very great, however, in the circumstances in which either of these two virtues is displayed. In one case, there is a natural relaxation and loosening of the soul. In the other, there is an unnatural pain. Hence, these circumstances, between which a great distinction can be drawn, belong to the category of indifferent things, but the virtue shown in each case is equal. So, he's answering the question, the objection of, is it really no difference between joy and an unyielding endurance of pain? Are those really the same? I mean, isn't it harder to endure pain than just be joyful? And he's saying, no, they actually are the same because it's just different ways in which the soul, this greatest good is being expressed. In one case, it's a natural relaxation, loosening of the soul. In the other case, there's a natural pain. So it's the circumstances that are drawing out the differences in the virtue. 15. Virtue is not changed by the matter with which it deals. If the matter is hard and stubborn, it does not make the virtue worse. If pleasant and joyous, it does not make it better. Therefore, virtue necessarily means equal. For, in each case, what is done with equal uprightness and equal wisdom and with equal honor. Hence, the states of goodness involved are equal, and it is impossible for a man to transcend these states of goodness by conducting himself better, either the one man in his joy or the other amid his suffering. And two goods, neither of which can possibly be better, are equal. So again, he's making, the logical case here, what you would call philosophy today of the logic of things, and he's saying virtue doesn't change based on the context, based on the matter in which it deals. All right? If it's a hard and stubborn matter, it doesn't make it worse. If it's a pleasant and joyous one, it doesn't make it better. Okay? It is just always equal. Verse 16. For if things which are extrinsic to virtue can either diminish or increase virtue, then that which is honorable ceases to be the only good. If you grant this, honor has wholly perished. And why? Let me tell you. It is because no act is honorable that is done by an unwilling agent. That is compulsory. Every honorable act is voluntary. Alloy it with reluctance, complains cowardice or fear, and it loses its best characteristic, self-approval. That which is not free cannot be honorable, for fear means slavery. All right, so there's a lesson in this. He's saying, for if things which are extrinsic to virtue can either diminish or increase its virtue, then that which is honorable ceases to be the only good. So he's saying that if you have something that is virtuous, right, but things outside of it can make it more so or less, then what is honorable is not the only good, all right? And if you accept this, then honor has perished. Why has it perished? Okay. Because it has to be done by a willing agent. Otherwise, it's compulsory. And so, if something outside it makes it greater, if something that you do makes you more virtuous because of something outside of a choice that you've made, then that can't be so, right? It destroys the whole idea. But this bigger concept in here, that's a bit of a side note, is this idea that honor requires a willing agent. So what does this mean in your life? This means that you don't get points just for showing up. You don't get points for just not doing the wrong thing. You get points for doing the right thing and for choosing to do the right thing. If you happen to be lucky and you win something looks good on you, it does not make you good. You have to actually make a conscious choice. You have to fight the battle. You have to have self-approval. You have to choose the path. It is not enough to have not chosen the wrong path. You must choose the right path. In verse 17, he says, "The honorable is wholly free from anxiety and is calm. If it ever objects, laments, or regards anything as evil, it becomes subject to disturbance and begins to flounder about amid great confusion. For, on one side, the semblance of right calls to it. On the other, the suspension of evil drags it back. Therefore, when a man is about to do something honorable, he should not regard any obstacles as evils, even though he regard them as inconvenient, but he should will to do the deed, and do it willingly. For every honorable act is done without commands or compulsion. It is unalloyed and contains no immixture of evil." So again, he's talking about honor and doing an honorable thing. He says the honorable is wholly free from anxiety and is calm. Okay, so if it objects, if it laments or regards anything as evil, then it becomes subject to this disturbance and it begins to flounder amidst confusion, right? Because one side's calling it to do the right thing, the other side is the suspicion of evil. It drags it back. So when you're going to do something honorable, you shouldn't regard any obstacles as evils, but just inconvenient. And then you go forth and do it willingly, right? It has to be done willingly, just like we said. In verse 18, he says, "I know what you may reply to me at this point. Are you trying to make us believe that it does not matter whether a man feels joy or whether he lies upon the rack and tires out his torturer? I might say in answer, Epicurus also maintains that the wise man, though he is being burned in the bull of Phalaris, will cry out, 'Tis pleasant and concerns me not at all.' Why need you wonder if I maintain that he who reclines at the banquet and the victim who stoutly withstands torture possesses equal goods, when Epicurus maintains a thing that is harder to believe, namely, that it is pleasant to be roasted in this way?" So, all right, a few things to break down here. So his question is, are you trying to make us believe that it doesn't matter whether a man feels joy or whether he is tortured and does it in good spirit? And he quotes Epicurus, and he says that the wise man, though he's burned in the bull of Phalaris, will cry out, "'Tis pleasant and concerns me not at all." Now, the bull of Phalaris was a torture device. It was this metal bull. I think it was bronze or whatever it was made out of. And they would put someone in there and they would cook them in there. They would heat it up over the fire. Definitely not a pleasant thing at all. I mean, and here's something to think about too. Just as we're going through this, as we're reading through this, I think this is something really important to understand about Stoic philosophy in the time period and the people of this time. It was not an easy time to live. It was not so there was a lot of torture. I mean, horrible torture, really bad things. When we talk about being impaled, burned at the stake, being drawn in quarter, they devised a lot of ways to torture people. That was pretty bad, really, really bad. All right. Not only that, but you have to understand that in this time period also that this could happen to you if you piss off the wrong person. So when we talk about people speaking out and voicing things, and how did people let things get this way or allow these things to happen? They were afraid. They were scared, rightly so. If you lived in these times, would you just be quiet and do what you're supposed to do? Quite possibly. So, we look at the world today and we look at some of the stuff that happened with the masks and the mandates and stuff like that, and we see all these people cowering in fear, and it's kind of funny. We see human nature, but you kind of get a glimpse as to imagine if the penalties were being burned alive, if if you could if you didn't have any kind of rights, you could piss off the wrong person, and you could be facing torture, right? I don't want to sidetrack too much from this, but I want you to understand that exercising these virtues at this time in history was much more difficult. It was rough in many, many ways. And so to speak out and to say things, to fight against injustice, and many times it didn't just mean risking your life. It meant risking extreme amounts of torture. And this is what a lot of people endured during that time. So it just kind of gives you a whole respect for this. And then also, think about how difficult it would be to be virtuous in these cases, right? I mean, what happens to you and you complain and you get upset? Versus Epicurus saying the wise man being burned inside of this bowl, being burned alive, says, this is pleasant and concerns me not at all. And he's not saying to say this to taunt the person torturing you, or he's saying for you to really actually embody this, to accept whatever comes. This is really the call. If you really want to understand Stoicism and Stoic philosophy, this is what it is to endure all the things, to not see them as bad. That's really what it is, right? And so, again, he's saying in this verse here that these are they're the same virtue, which is interesting because if you think about it, what does that mean? Also, it means that if you can't really experience joy unless you're the kind of person who could also experience torture and accept it and endure it. Because they're the same. It's the same person. It's the same, right? It's the same quality. So if you're wondering why you can't experience joy, maybe you need to look at the other end. Maybe stop chasing joy and start chasing endurance. That might help. All right. In verse 9, he says, but the reply, which I do make, is that there is a great difference between joy and pain. If I'm asked to choose, I shall seek the former and avoid the latter. The former is according to nature, the latter contrary to it. So long as they are rated by the standard, there's a great gulf between. But when it comes to a question of the virtue involved, the virtue in each case is the same, whether it comes through joy or through sorrow. So he's saying, is there a difference? Yeah, there's a difference, obviously. Okay. I'm going to choose joy, not pain. Right? But when we're just talking about virtue, no, there's still no difference. Even though I would rather have one than the other. Vexation and pain and other inconveniences are of no consequence, for they are overcome by virtue. Just as the brightness of the sun dims all lesser lights, so virtue by its own greatness shatters and overwhelms all pains, annoyances, and wrongs. And whether its radiance reaches all light, which shine without the help of virtue, are distinguished, and inconveniences, when they come in contact with virtue, play no more important a part than does a storm cloud at sea. So he's saying here that these things, these bad things, they're of no consequence. Why? Because they are overcome by virtue. It's like the sun. It dims all lesser lights, and virtue does that, and it overwhelms all the pains, annoyances, and wrongs. And so the thing to think about here is that if you have this virtue, it makes it so you don't actually experience to the degree all these other bad things, because it is such a brightly shining light. And perhaps you've felt this at times when you have been heroic, when you've been brave, when someone you cared about needed to be defended, and all of a sudden fear, it didn't exist anymore. Or pain maybe didn't exist anymore. In verse 21, he says, this can be proved to you by the fact that the good man will hasten unhesitatingly to any noble deed, even though he be confronted by the hangman, the torturer, and the stake, he will persist, regarding not what he must suffer, but what he must do, and he will entrust himself as readily to an honorable deed as he would to a good man. He will consider it advantageous to himself, safe, propitious, and he will hold the same view concerning the honorable deed, even though it be fraught with sorrow and hardship, as concerning a good man who is poor or wasting away in exile. Okay. This is hard teaching here if you really listen to what he's saying. He's saying that a good man will hasten unsteadily to any noble deed, even though he be confronted by the hangman, the torturer, and the stake. He will persist regarding not what he must suffer, but what he must do. So, again, this comes down to what I was saying before, and this is why I made an emphasis on this, is that are you willing to do what is right because it is right, despite the chance of death? How about of torture? How about of extreme torture? But that's what he's saying the good man will do. So we really have to question ourselves and say, would I do that? What would happen? Would you compromise your integrity? Would you compromise your values? Would you allow someone else to suffer if you were facing death or torture? If you're facing one of these crazy tortures, if that was the penalty of what you were risking, would you still do the right thing? And if the answer is no, well, you're not there yet. We're not there yet. Right? So that's what we're striving towards. And that's what the mark is. The mark is higher than what we may have thought it is. But that's what it is. He's spelling it out here. He's saying that this is what a good man will do. This is what a virtuous man will do. This is what virtue will do. It's hard. It's not easy. Come now, contrast a good man who is rolling in wealth with a man who has nothing, except that in himself he has all things. They will be equally good, though they experience unequal fortune. This same standard, as I have remarked, is to be applied to things as well as to men. Virtue is just as praiseworthy if it dwells in a sound and free body as in one which is sickly or in bondage. Okay, so this is pretty simple. He's saying, a wealthy man and a man has nothing, but the man who has virtue has all the things in himself. They're equal. And so he's saying virtue, if it dwells in a good body, is the same as if it dwells in a sickly one. Right? Now, again, a lot of this was against many of the teachings of the time, where a lot of times in society and culture, in various cultures, they believed that a sickly body was an indication of bad karma, of an unvirtuous person. They deserve this. This is why they got this. This is a lot of how much of history was up until this point, or even during this point. Therefore, as regards to your own virtue also, you will not praise it any more if fortune has favored it by granting you a sound body than if fortune has endowed you with a body that is crippled in some member, since that would mean rating a master low because he is dressed like a slave. For all those things over which chance holds sway are chattels, money, person, position. They are weak, shifting, prone to perish, and of uncertain tenure. On the other hand, the works of virtue are free and unsubdued, neither more worthy to be sought when fortune treats them kindly, nor less worthy when any adversity weighs upon them. So he's saying, look, here. So from here on out, I want you to think like this. Don't think about your own virtue based on you having been lucky enough to have a sound body. Okay? Or or less if it's a crippled body. Okay, so that's the same as like rating a master low because he's dressed as a slave. He's still a master. And he's saying the things that chance holds sway over are no good. They're worthless. Money, person, position, they're weak. They're shifting. They're prone to perish. Okay? But he's saying that virtue, the works of virtue are free and unsubdued. Okay? They're not more worthy when fortune treats them kindly, nor less when adversity weighs upon them. Now, friendship, in the case of men, corresponds to desirability in the case of things. You would not, I fancy, love a good man if he were rich any more than if he were poor, nor would you love a strong and muscular person more than one who was of a slender and delicate constitution. Accordingly, neither will you seek or love a good thing that is mirthful and tranquil more than one that is full of perplexity and toil. So he's saying, he's making the comparison to friendships. You wouldn't like someone just because they're rich, I hope, or have muscles versus someone else. And so the same here about virtue. In verse 25, he says, or if you do this, you will, in the case of two equally good men, care more for him who is neat and well-groomed than him who is dirty and unkempt. You would next go so far as to care more for a good man who is sound in all his limbs without blemish than one who is weak or purblind. And gradually your fastidiousness would reach such a point that of two equally just and prudent men, you would choose him who has long curling hair, whenever the virtue in each one is equal. The inequality in the other attributes is not apparent, for all other things are not parts but merely accessories. So he's saying, so maybe you would choose based on looks and appearances. If so, it will get to a point where it doesn't make sense, or you would choose a person based on their long curling hair. That's the ridiculousness of that, right? So he says, would any man judge his children so unfairly as to care more for a healthy son than one who is sickly? Or for a tall child of unusual stature more than one who is short or of middling height? Wild beasts show no favoritism among their offspring. They lie down in order to suckle all alike. Birds make fair distribution of their food. Ulysses hastens back to the rocks of Ithaca as eagerly as Agamemnon speeds to the kingly walls of Mycenae. For no man loves his native land because it is great. He loves it is because it is his own. So again, he's just making the comparison here between your children and animals, and this idea that the reason why you value something is because it's yours, not because you don't make this distinction based on the external appearances. And what is the purpose of all this? That you may know that virtue regards all her works in the same light, as if they were her children, showing equal kindness to all and still deeper kindness to those which encounter hardships, for even parents lean with more affection towards those of their offspring whom they feel pity. Virtue, too, does not necessarily love more deeply those of her works which she beholds in trouble and under heavy burdens, but, like good parents, she gives them more of her fostering care. So, again, he's bringing it back to virtue, and that virtue regards all her works in the same light, as if they're her children. Okay? And he is making the point here that, just like if your child is injured or is less fortunate, that you might have an extra pity for them. Virtue also does the same, but it doesn't mean that virtue loves more deeply. But he's saying that it may be a little bit more present. It may be a little easier to find in a person who has suffered greatly. I think that's really the lesson here, is that, sometimes if you're given everything, it's harder for you to be virtuous. But if you have had some disabilities, if you had some setbacks in life, you're more likely to be fostered by virtue. Why is no good greater than any other good? It is because nothing can be more fitting than that which is fitting, and nothing more level than that which is level. You cannot say that one thing is more equal to a given object than another thing. Hence, also nothing is more honorable than that which is honorable. Okay, fair enough. Accordingly, if all the virtues are by nature equal, then the three varieties of goods are equal. This is what I mean. There is an equality between feeling joy and self-control and suffering pain with self-control. The joy in the one case does not surpass the other in steadfastness of soul that gulps down the groan when the victim is in the clutches of the torturer. Goods of the first kind are desirable, while those of the second are worthy of admiration. And in each case, they are none the less equal because whatever inconvenience attaches to the latter is compensated by the qualities of the good, which is so much greater. So again, he's just kind of bringing it all together to say that, look, if virtues are the same, then the goods attached to them are the same as well. They have equal value. Any man who believes them to be unequal is turning his gaze away from the virtues themselves and is surveying mere externals. True goods have the same weight and the same width. The spurious sort contain much emptiness. Hence, when they are weighed in balance, they are found wanting, although they look imposing and grand to the gaze. So all he's saying here is that if you think that they're unequal, then you're not actually looking at the virtues that underlie them. Okay, you're looking at the externals. You're looking at the external circumstances in order to judge things. He said the true goods, they have the same. They're the same. They have the same weight, same width. Okay, if you measure them, they would be the same. Yes, my dear Lucilius, the good which true reason approves is solid and everlasting. It strengthens the spirit and exalts it, so that it will always be on the heights. But those things which are thoughtlessly praised and are goods in the opinion of the mob merely puff us up with empty joy. And again, those things which are feared as if they are evils merely inspire trepidation in men's minds, for the mind is disturbed by the semblance of danger, just as animals are disturbed. So what he's saying here is he's saying good, the true good, is solid, is everlasting. It strengthens the spirit. It exalts it. Okay? But the things that are thoughtlessly praised, okay, the external things, the things that are not goods, they're just goods in the opinion of the mob, they puff you up with empty joy. They're not real. Okay? Because they didn't come from the internal. They came from the external. They came from fortune. They came from chance. They might make you feel good. And what does this mean, honestly? Okay? What this means is this. It means that, like, look, if you happen to be fortunate in get a good job because you got lucky to a degree. And it doesn't mean you haven't worked for it, but you're making good money and you just happen to get hired for this particular job. That does not make you good. Like, people will praise you because you're making so much money, but that doesn't change who you are. That praise that you're getting, that external, to a large degree, is attributed to luck. Yeah, there are some things that you have done, of course, but what I'm saying is that all of these external things that we think that people praise us on, if they're like, oh, wow, you are tall, or you have great hair, or what, any of these things that we might have, that we have not earned truly, that are not the internal attributes, those things are not valuable. Those are it's not the real virtue. It's what people who don't understand virtue are praising. Hence, it is without reason that both these things distract and sting the spirit. The one is not worthy of joy, nor the other of fear. It is reason alone that is unchangeable, that holds fast to its decisions. For reason is not a slave to the senses, but a ruler over them. Reason is equal to reason, and one straight line to another. Therefore, virtue also is equal to virtue. Virtue is nothing else than right reason. All virtues are reasons. Reasons are reasons. If they're right reasons, if they're right, they're also equal. So again, he's really just driving home this point that it is the same. That these things are exactly the same. As reason is, so also are actions. Therefore, all actions are equal. For since they resemble reason, they also resemble each other. Moreover, I hold that actions are equal to each other insofar as they are honorable and right actions. There will be, of course, great differences according to the material varies, as it becomes now broader and now narrower, now glorious and now base, now manifold in scope and now limited. However, that which is best in all cases is equal, they are honorable. So now he's equating it to actions. Obviously, he's talking about virtuous actions that you take. Those are all also the same. And he says, in the same way, all good men, insofar as they are good, are equal. They are indeed differences of age. One is older, another younger, of body. One is comely, another is ugly, of fortune. This man is rich, that man poor. This one influential, powerful, and well-known to cities and peoples. That man unknown to most and is obscure. But all in respect to wherein they are good are equal. So now he's equating it to people. All right. And he's saying that a good man is always a good man. It doesn't matter what clothes he's wearing. It doesn't matter what his outward appearance is. In verse 35, the senses do not decide upon things good and evil. They do not know what is useful and what is not useful. They cannot record their opinion unless they are brought face to face with a fact. They can neither see into the future nor recollect the past, and they do not know what results from what. But it is from such knowledge that a sequence and succession of actions is woven and a unity of life is created, a unity which will proceed in a straight course. Reason, therefore, is a judge of good and evil. That which is foreign and external she regards as dross, and that which is neither good nor evil she judges merely accessory, insignificant, and trivial, for all her good resides in the soul. Okay, so let's kind of break this passage down here. He's saying that the senses don't decide upon the things that are good and evil. So it's not what you see or what you taste or feel or hear, okay? They don't know, okay? They can't record their opinion unless they're brought face to face with fact, okay? So they can't see in the future, they can't recollect the past, they don't know what came from what, all right? But it is from such knowledge that a sequence and successions of actions is woven and a unity of life is created. So, but through these senses, we are able to detect and see what has happened and how this person has acted or progressed. And that's how we can get to reason. Reason is the judge of good and evil. Reason is what we should use to determine what is good. But there are certain goods which reason regards as primary, to which she addresses herself purposely. These are, for example, victory, good children, and the welfare of one's country. Certain others she regards as secondary. These become manifest only in adversity. For example, equanimity and enduring severe illness or exile. Certain goods are indifferent. These are no more according to nature than contrary to nature. For example, a discreet gait and a sedate posture in a chair. For sitting is an act that is not less according to nature than standing or walking. Okay, so here's a little bit of confusion here. So he's saying that there are certain goods which reason regards as primary. Okay, so she addresses herself purposely. Okay, so victory, good children, the welfare of one's country. These are the goods that are just, they make sense, okay? They make sense to you. They're rational to you, okay? Now, the secondary ones are only existing in adversary. Again, we had these three categories, and he's talking about those categories, right? So, and then he's saying that there's a third category that it's just things that we consider to be good, okay? And again, a lot of this is debatable here, right? So, for example, the welfare of one's country, is that really a good at this time? I think Seneca certainly thought so. But I would say from our perspective today, we would say, I don't know if that really fits. I would say I don't think that fits it. That's not really, it doesn't matter your country or someone else's country. I think maybe there's this idea of protecting the people you care about that could be in there. Okay. And then even these ones about how to walk and how to sit. Is this really something that is a good or is virtue? Perhaps there's some truth to it, but the two kinds of good which are of higher order are different. The primary are according to nature, such as deriving joy from the dutiful behavior of one's children and from the well-being of one's country. The secondary are contrary to nature, such as fortitude in resisting torture or enduring thirst when illness makes the vitals feverish. Okay, so again, he's making the distinction between these two. What then, you say, can anything that is contrary to nature be a good? Of course not. But that in which this good takes its rise is sometimes contrary to nature. For being wounded, wasting away over fire, or being afflicted with bad health, such things are contrary to nature, but it is in accordance with nature for man to preserve an indomitable soul amid such distress. So he's making the distinction here that it's not, these things aren't according to nature. So they're against nature. They're not natural things. But it's not these things themselves that are the good or the virtue. They bring about the good or the virtue, the circumstance in which it's exhibited, such as endurance of torture. Okay. In verse 39, he says, to explain my thought briefly, the material with which a good is concerned is sometimes contrary to nature, but a good itself never is contrary, since no good is without reason, and reason is in accordance with nature. Okay. So, the material which is a good is concerned is sometimes contrary to nature. So the thing, right? But the good itself is never contrary. So the endurance, the torture, or the pain and suffering you're going through might be contrary to nature, but your endurance of it is not. Okay? Since no good is without reason, and reason is in accordance with nature. Okay? Okay. What then, you ask, is reason? It is copying nature. And what, you say, is the greatest good that a man can possess? It is to conduct oneself according to what nature wills. So here he's giving the answer to what is the greatest good that a man can possess. And it is to conduct oneself according to what nature wills. So to go along with the flow, to accept reality, to accept what is, to not go against what is natural. Okay. In verse 40, there is no doubt, says the objector, what peace affords more happiness when it has not been assailed than when it has been recovered at the cost of great slaughter. There is no doubt also, he continues, that health which has not been impaired affords more happiness than health which has been restored to soundness by means of force, as it were, and by endurance of suffering after serious illnesses that threaten life itself. And similarly, there will be no doubt that joy is a greater good than a soul's struggle to endure to the bitter and end the torments of wounds or burning at the stake. All right, so what is he saying here? He hasn't addressed this here, but he says this is what the objector says. Okay? He's saying that peace is better. Okay, it gives you more happiness when it hasn't been assailed than when it's been recovered at some cost. All right, he's saying that if you're healthy and you don't have to go through sickness, that's better than having to go through sickness and coming through it. And in verse 41, he says, by no means, for things that result from hazard admit of wide distinctions, since they are rated according to their usefulness in the eyes of those who experience them. But with regard to goods, the only point to be considered is that they are in agreement with nature, and this is equal in the case of all goods. When at a meeting of Senate we vote in favor of someone's motion, it cannot be said A is more accord with the motion than B. All alike vote for the same motion. I make the same statement with regard to virtues. They are all in accord with nature, and I make it in regard to goods also. They are all in accord with nature. So he's countering the argument and saying, no, that's not the case. It doesn't matter how it came about. It just matters that it is, and they are equal. So it might seem that one way would be better, and you might prefer one way, but that does not change the nature of it. One man dies young, another in old age, and still another in infancy, having enjoyed nothing more than a mere glimpse out into life. They have all been equally subject to death, even though death has permitted the one to proceed further along the pathway of life, has cut off the life of the second in its flower, and has broken off the life of the third in its very beginning. Okay? So he's saying here in this case, this is just another example, right? If you have someone that dies old or young or as an infant, they're still subject to death, even though the length of time was different. It is still death. All right. Um, some get the release at the dinner table. Others extend their sleep into the sleep of death. Some are blotted out during dissipation. Now contrast with these persons, individuals who have been pierced by the sword or bitten to death by the snakes, or crushed in ruins, or tortured piecemeal out of existence by prolonged twisting of their sinews. Some of these departures may be regarded as better, some as worse, but the act of dying is equal in all. The methods of ending life are different, but the end is one and the same. Death has no degrees of greater or less, for it has the same limit in all instances, the finishing of life. So he's using death as the example, as a great equalizer, and you can view this as virtue. He's saying, just like death, it doesn't matter how it comes about, it's still the same thing. So is this virtue or these goods. The same thing holds true, I assure you, concerning goods. You will find one amid circumstances of pure pleasure, another amid sorrow and bitterness. The one controls the favors of fortune, the other overcomes her onslaught. Each is equally a good, although the one travels a level and easy road, and the other a rough road. And the end of them all is the same. They are goods. They are worthy of praise. They accompany virtue and reason. Virtue makes all things that acknowledges equal to one another. So I think that goes without explanation here. He's saying that these things are still equally good, even though one is a pleasant path to go on and one is not. All right. You need not wonder that this is one of our principles we find mentioned in the works of Epicurus, two goods, of which his supreme good, or blessedness, is composed, namely, a body free from pain and a soul free from disturbance. These goods, if they are complete, do not increase, for how can that which is complete increase? The body is, let us suppose, free from pain. What increase can there be to this absence of pain? The soul is composed and calm. What increase can there be to this tranquility? Okay, so he's going back to Epicurus, and he's saying that this is what Epicurus considered the two goods, essentially a body free from pain and a soul free from disturbance. And he's saying, what could be more than those? Those are at the highest, right? Just as fair weather, purified into the purest brilliancy, does not admit a still greater degree of clearness, so when a man takes care of his body and of his soul, weaving the texture of his good from both, his condition is perfect, and he has found the consummation of his prayers. If there is no commotion in his soul or pain in his body, whatever delight falls to his lot over and above these two things does not increase his supreme good. They merely season it, so to speak, and add spice to it. For the absolute good of a man's nature is satisfied with peace in the body and peace in the soul. So he's saying that it can't get better than that. Yeah, you can have some other things and they season that, but it is still the supreme good. In verse 47, he says, I can show you at this moment the writings of Epicurus, a graded list of goods just like that of our own school. For there are some things, he declares, which he prefers should fall to his lot, such as bodily rest free from all inconvenience and relaxation of the soul, as it takes delight in the contemplation of its own goods. And there are other things which, though he would prefer that they did not happen, he nevertheless praises and approves. For example, the kind of resignation in times of ill health and serious suffering to which I alluded a moment ago, and which Epicurus displayed on the last and most blessed day of his life. For he tells us that he had to endure excruciating agony from a diseased bladder and from an ulcerated stomach, so acute that it permitted no increase of pain. And yet, he says, that day was none the less happy, and no man can spend such a day in happiness unless he possesses the supreme good. Okay, so we're getting close to the end here, but what he's saying here is that, again, if you look at Epicurus, okay, and he says that he can show you in the writings a great list of goods, right? Just like we have in the Stoic school, right? And there's things that he prefers, right? That would be good. He wants a body free from pain, and and a soul that can relax and is undisturbed. However, that even on his deathbed when he was dying, and he wrote about how much pain he was in, he said it was still a happy day. Okay, so that he's saying that no man can spend such a day in happiness unless he possesses the supreme good. So he must have possessed that supreme good. We therefore find mentioned, even by Epicurus, those goods which one would prefer not to experience, which, however, because circumstances have decided thus, must be welcomed and approved and placed on a level with the highest goods. We cannot say that the good which has rounded out a happy life, the good for which Epicurus rendered thanks in his last words he uttered, is not equal to the greatest. So he's saying the ability to endure that is also just as good, and we can't just say that we like the good things that come into our lives, but not the things that we don't like. Right? There's still a good in this endurance of it. In verse 49, he says, "Allow me, excellent Lucilius, to utter still bolder word. If any goods could be greater than others, I should prefer those which seem harsh to those which are mild and alluring, and should pronounce them greater. For it is of more an accomplishment to break one's way through difficulties than to keep joy within bounds." So he's saying that if we were going to say that some goods were greater, I would actually pick the ones that come through suffering. Why? Because it's harder. It's harder to endure torture than it is to just be joyful within bounds. It requires the same use of reason, I am fully aware, for a man to endure prosperity well, and also to endure misfortune bravely. That man may be just as brave who sleeps in front of the ramparts without fear of danger when no enemy attacks the camp, as the man who, when the tendons of his legs have been severed, holds himself up on his knees and does not let fall his weapons, but it is to the blood-stained soldier returning from the front that men cry, "Well done, thou hero." And therefore I should bestow greater praise upon those goods that have stood trial and show courage and have fought it out with fortune. So again, he's saying that, if you're going to make a distinction in judgment, it's those goods that the hard stuff, right? It is the person who has been injured in battle but still fights on. It is that is stronger. Should I hesitate whether to give greater praise to the maimed and shriveled hand of Mucius than to the uninjured hand of the bravest man in the world? There stood Mucius, despising the enemy and despising the fire, and watched his hand as it dripped blood over the fire on his enemy's altar, until Porsenna, envying the fame of the hero whose punishment he was advocating, ordered the fire to be removed against the will of the victim. So what he's talking about here is the case where Mucius placed his hand into the fire of the enemy in order to compel them to stop the attack, to basically to do what he wanted. And what happened was that they realized what he was doing in the sense that he was becoming famous. He was becoming this hero because he was showing how great his resolve was and how weak theirs was, right? And so they didn't want to continue to allow him to do that. So they actually removed the fire from him, right? At least that's how the legend goes, okay? And he's saying, should I give greater praise to a man who has an injured hand than to this guy who did this great and noble thing? Why should I not reckon this good among the primary goods and deem it in so far greater than those other goods which are unattended by danger and have made no trial of fortune? As if a rarer thing to have overcome a foe with a hand lost than with a hand armed? What then, you say? Shall you desire this good for yourself? Of course I shall, for this is a thing that a man cannot achieve unless he can also desire it. So this is interesting. He's saying, why should I not reckon this good among the primary goods, right? What this man did, okay? And deem it greater than those goods which didn't have to face danger and made no trial of fortune, okay? As it's rarer to have overcome a foe with a hand lost than with a hand armed. So he lost his hand in order to overcome his foe, as opposed to fighting, right? Which is rarer, okay? And then he's saying, do you desire this good for yourself, right? Would you want your own hand to be burned up and, to face this? And he says, yes. And he says, because if you can't desire it, you can't achieve it, which is interesting. Should I desire instead to be allowed to stretch out my limbs for my slaves to massage, or to have a woman or a man changed into likeness of a woman pull my finger joints? I cannot help believing that Mucius was all more lucky because he manipulated the flames as calmly as if he were holding out his hand to the manipulator. He has wiped out all his previous mistakes. He finished the war unarmed and maimed, and with that stump of a hand, he conquered two kings. Farewell. So, this is a long one. To end it here, he says, should I rather have my hand massaged? Okay. And he says that I think Mucius was more lucky. Okay. Because he was able to do this. He was able to manipulate the flames as calmly as he's holding out his hand to manipulate her. He wiped out his previous mistakes. He basically was able to prove his true virtue by this one act. And he conquered two kings in the process of doing it. So great respect for him. So he's saying that it is of extremely high value. So this is a long letter, very long, obviously. But the big thing I think that you can gather from this is that it's not what you get in life. It's not how you look. It's not, the things that you got luckily, right? That it's not the bad things, it's not the good things. It is how you handle the things in life. It's the virtue that you have. It's the choice that you make, and it's all the same whether you handle a good fortune in the right way, right? Or you handle suffering in the right way. They're all the same. They all come from that same virtue. And I think that's important to understand because it helps you to realize that the bad things are not necessarily bad. There are these opportunities that you can be happy in all the things if you have this virtue within you. And the way to gain it or to practice it is through the endurance of the hard things. And when things are good, the enjoyment of those things, to be able to be joyful, to not let those things suck you in, because both the good and the bad can destroy us. And I think that's kind of the thing that we have to watch out for.